Good evening. Good evening. Can everyone hear me? Have I gone mute? Am I on mute? Can you be on mute in real life? I don't know. Sometimes I think I might be. Good evening. Welcome. My name is Mark Mamagonian. I'm the Director of Academic Affairs here at this august institution, the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, and thank you for being with us. I know there are competing events this week. There's a lot going on generally, but we appreciate your presence live or virtual and your continued interest in and support of our programs. This is the first time I can remember in a number of years, actually, that we've actually had an event on April 24th. So it's obviously it's of special significance to be with you tonight. All of us, not just all of us who work in the Armenian world, all of us who are Armenian or work in the Armenian world, do what we do and live our lives with the thoughts and the memories of our loved ones who were survivors or victims or who were affected in some way by the Armenian genocide. I'm sure there isn't a one of us in the room who hasn't been touched by it, whether it's your parent, grandparent, or other relative. So we don't just think about these things on April 24th, of course. It's with us all the time. But today it has a special weight, let's say. Following this program, we welcome your questions, those of you here and those of you who are online. If you're on Zoom, please use the Zoom Q&A function, and once that concludes, we'll have a reception for those of you here, and we invite you to stay and enjoy some refreshments and some community, some company. It's nice to be together at certain times, especially. Please mute your cell phones, and please, no recording. This is something I always forget to mention, but it's really important. So please spare us having to hear your phone going off during the program. Allow me to please mention a couple of upcoming events. Tomorrow in New Haven, Connecticut at Yale University, we're very pleased to be co-sponsoring two important events, one with Artak Beglarian, the former human rights advocate and ombudsman for the Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh, who will be speaking at Yale University at 12 o'clock tomorrow, and as part of a panel discussion with Karni Kirkonian in the evening at 5 p.m. It's a little bit down the road in New Haven. It's in person only, not online, but if you are able to go, I would encourage you to do so. If you're later in the day online or in Los Angeles, our good friend Bedros Dermatosian will be giving the a genocide memorial lecture at UCLA entitled Sahag II Kabayan, Catholicos of Cilicia as Witness to Massacres and the Armenian Genocide. This is in person at UCLA and on Zoom. On this coming Sunday at the Armenian Cultural Foundation in Arlington, there's a program with author Narine Abgarian, author of To Go On Living, and she will be speaking in person there. Please attend if you are able to. On May 3rd, NAASR's Ait Penkim for Children comes back with a roar. Stories, songs, and games in Armenian presented by the fabulously talented Tanya. And if you have any questions about this or would like to know more about these programs generally, see Ani Babayan, NAASR's library curator, who is somewhere in the building. And on Thursday, May 8th, here in this room, we will have the 4th annual Vartan Gregorian lecture presented by scholars Huri Beberian and Tallinn Grigor on the Armenian woman, minoritarian agency, and the making of Iranian modernity. This is an in-person only event, in person, in this room. We hope you can join us in some fashion, online or in person, for some of these upcoming events, which are, as always, supported by you, our members and donors. And as a small thank you to our members, we will raffle off a signed copy of Professor Semerdjian's excellent book, Remnants, to a lucky NAASR member. And Elyse, don't leave the building without signing a copy of the book. If you're already a NAASR member and are here in person, sign in, and we will, or if you're on Zoom, we have your name, we will find you, and we will notify the winning person by email tomorrow. Now, it's my pleasure and privilege to ask our friend Father Vaskan Kuzuyan of Holy Trinity Armenian Church to come up and lead us in a prayer. Father.
Thank you, Mark. So let us honor our ancestors. If we are able to, please rise. We'll offer the prayer for the holy martyrs of the Armenian Genocide. Բսակիչ Սրբոց Քրիստոս, որ բսակես ու սուրբս քո եւ արնեսս գամս հերգյուղածած քոց, եւ նայիս սիրով եւ քաղցությամբ հարարածս քո, լուր մեզ հերգնիցի սրբութենեքու մե բարեխոսությամբ սուրբ աստվածածնին եւ աղաչունակամային սրբոց քոց եւ սրբոց նախադագացն, որ կադերեցան հնդացս հայոց ցեղասպանության վասն հավատո եւ վասն հայրենիած. Լուր մեզ դեր եւ ողորմիա, ներյա, քավյա եւ թողս մեղս մեր, արժանավորյա քոությամբ փալավորես քեզն հորն սրբոքվույթ, այժմ եւ միշեւ ավիդյանս հավելենից, amen. Christ our God, you crown your saints with triumph, and you do the will of all who fear you, looking after your creatures with love and kindness. Hear us from your holy and heavenly realm by the intercession of Holy Mother of God, and by the prayers of all your saints, especially the holy martyrs who gave their lives during the Armenian Genocide for faith and for the homeland. Hear us, Lord, and show us your mercy. Forgive, redeem, and pardon our sins, and make us worthy thankfully to glorify you with the Father and with the Holy Spirit, now and always, unto the ages of ages. Amen.
Thank you, Dayr. Now, please welcome our friend Tanya Bartevyan. Tanya is a talented and accomplished pianist to whom we're grateful for offering a prelude to tonight's program. And please let me mention that Tanya will be performing a piano recital titled Freedom, Courage, and Love on Friday, May 16 at the Trinitarian Congregational Church in Concord, Mass, and you are encouraged to attend and hear her perform. Please welcome Tanya Bartevyan.
I'm going to start with a very small improvisation on Armenian song, and then play a very short prelude by my friend Tanya Rabi, a Belmont resident, and then I will play the second movement of Florence Price's piano sonata. Florence Price is the first African-American woman whose symphony was played by a major symphony orchestra, Chicago Symphony in 1933, and I think that we will find her music very appropriate to our sentiments of today. And it's gorgeous music. Thank you.
Tanya, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And Mark, thank you. That was excellent page turning. Actually, before I introduce our speaker, let me put the cover down so our friends will be able to see over here. Now, let me introduce our speaker. Dr. Elyse Semerdjian is the Robert Aram and Marian Kalustian and Stephen and Marian Mugar Chair of Armenian Genocide Studies at the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University. And it's a real pleasure for us to have her here. It's the first time she has spoken here as the holder of the Kalustian Mugar Chair at Clark. So it's a special evening for us to have her here. And when I talked to her some weeks ago about possibly giving a talk on April 24th, she had the excellent idea of focusing on April 24th itself and what indeed could be more appropriate for the day. And it's really something that probably many of us know less about than we probably think we do. So Elyse is the author of Off the Straight Path, Illicit Sex, Law and Community in Ottoman Aleppo, Syracuse University Press, 2008, and more recently, Remnants, Embodied Archives of the Armenian Genocide, Stanford University Press, 2023, as well as many articles on gender, Ottoman Armenians, urban history, and law in the Ottoman Empire. So please welcome Dr. Elyse Semerdjian.
Thank you. I've been told under no circumstances am I to leave this microphone and this podium, so I'll be as fixed as I can be. I want to first thank Tanya for infusing the room with this beautiful music. It's my first time actually hearing Tanya play. We became virtual friends on a listserv many years ago, so what a delight. And also, thank you for giving us some hope and some art to inspire us today. And I want to also thank Mark and for hosting me, and NAASR. It is really quite an honor to be here. I am a recent transplant to this community. Thank you. Thank you. I'm a recent transplant to this community. I lived for 20 years in rural Washington State. So every time I wanted to commemorate, April 24th with other than myself, I had to fly somewhere to do so. So last year I was in Los Angeles, and now I get to drive just an hour away to be with you all. So really, it's really a pleasure to be with my new community, even on this day of commemoration, especially in the same room. I've been thinking about the question of commemoration for some time, especially in recent years while writing my book, Remnants, Embodied Archives of the Armenian Genocide. In that book, I examine the memory of the Armenian genocide through the framework of the body, skin, and bone, especially thinking about tattooed Armenian women and their skin. But it ends and completes in part 3 with the question of bones, especially at Dayr in Syria or the Syrian Desert. I examine the memory of Dayr, especially in the writings and art and memory practices of Armenians. And some of the questions I have are really about why we feel the impulse to commemorate the dead, what drives us to remember those who perished during the Armenian genocide, and what role does it play in holding our community together as a nation, especially a nation in diaspora. So having spent most of my career researching actually under authoritarian conditions in the Middle East, most of my research is in Syria. I'm interested in the ways that we grieve, especially in spaces where there sometimes are no formal monuments. I'll show later in this lecture how I've documented the history of Armenian journeys to Dayr, including digging up and collecting of bones of Armenian martyrs in the Syrian desert. I show the history of this practice, and I also theorize them to show how the collection of bones serves a mnemonic function to conjure the memory of martyred ancestors. In Armenian writings, those who embarked on those journeys often imagined the bones as enfleshed as ancestors, sometimes even seeing their ancestors marching before them in real time, as if it were 1915 all over again. So I'll speak more about this phenomenon in the last portion of the lecture and give you sort of a virtual tour of what it would be like to go on such a pilgrimage, especially since those pilgrimage practices have halted in light of the Syrian war. So we're privileged to have monuments in Armenia, in America, in more places. We know that many of these spaces where our ancestors were murdered have no formal monuments. We've erected symbolic gravestones to fill that absence. Many of our ancestors lived in places that now have new place names. Some of the evidence of the crime has been erased from the landscape. So Armenians erect these monuments when and where they can. In some places, though, they have permission to do so. In other places, they do not. In some places, a monument is out of the question. The invitation to reflect on April 24th, or maybe actually it was my offer to reflect on April 24th, it prompts one to consider how after 110 years, the Armenian community, through April 24th and other rituals and institutions like NAASR, continue to preserve and cohere through global ceremonies where today Armenians all over the world have recognized the crime of genocide committed against our people. From Yerevan to Damascus, from New York to Beirut, from France to Boston, Armenians have over the course of this very day performed rituals of mourning to remember the martyrs of the Armenian Genocide. And these rituals are not simple acts, but they constitute the preservation of a memory of our fallen ancestors, recognition of the loss of ancestral lands and home villages, and an understanding that the ongoing attempt to erase Armenians is evidenced in recent destruction of Artsakh as part of a century-long pattern of assaults on our community, and that includes also, I apologize for the quality of this photograph, but it also includes the memory of Hrant Dink, who we could think about as being yet another martyr, yet another figure who has fallen due to a trajectory that was initiated in 1915. So as many Armenians and their allies asserted in rituals of remembrance in Istanbul, before these rituals were halted around 3 or 4 years ago, they've started to bar these types of events. They often said, Buradayız, we are here, Menk Hosenk, we are here, and indeed we are still here. And our survival and perseverance is a cause for celebration. It is, in a way, our own Easter miracle. Today, I'll give you a short presentation on the evolution of some of these rituals of remembrance, and some of the details I will offer will be known to you. But I hope that some of them won't. Some of them might be a little bit off the beaten path, if you will. And I'll begin with some formal acts of remembrance, and then we'll go into, especially in Dayr, some less formal, informal practices that I document in my book. Here are some images from Project Save. Here are some images from Project Save. And I was not able to find images of some of the earliest commemorations in the United States, but I wanted to offer you a few to think about what was then called Martyrs' Day, which now we think of Armenian Genocide Commemoration Day. This is a timeline. If we look at it, you'll see, April 24th, of course, commemorates the arrest and disappearance of about 250 Armenian intellectuals who were rounded up through Istanbul on that very night of April 24th. And you'll see that through the ceremonies, it was often the intellectuals at the initial stages that were focused on. Over time, the rituals were generalized to include all Armenians who perished during the Armenian Genocide. And we also have, on May 27th, 1915, the Relocation and Resettlement Law, which is the mass deportation of Armenians, which was also code for killing, since many Armenians never were deported at all, but died in their own hometowns, home villages, etc. But what I want to follow with that is to look at a commemorative timeline. You might be surprised to know that, as far as I know, Boston was actually the first place to ever commemorate April 24th, but you can see it was on January 16th. So April 24th was not settled as a commemoration date for at least the first year. It's not until 1916 that we see a commemoration in Providence, Rhode Island, on April 24th, and eventually through encyclicals from the church, because the church has actually been a cornerstone to actually creating and preserving this ritual, often involved in it. And it was actually, there were multiple encyclicals, one from the Catholicosate of Sis and the other from Echmiadzin, that confirmed April 24th as a commemoration date. And then I will take you through a few instances where there were commemorations in Aleppo and also in Damascus. Eventually, we'll settle on the Armenian Republic, which I think we all know is where we have the formal monument within the Armenian state at Tsitsernakaberd, but that monument is the only official state memorial. The rest are often erected by the church or by community members. This is not going to be a comprehensive version of events. I think this history has yet to be written, but I did come across some magazines actually in the Clark collection and found this editorial in 1915, which was in the magazine Gochnag, which was published in New York. And in this periodical, we find one of the first calls for a national commemoration for a commemoration of martyrs, and it's actually in response to readers who were calling for it. Apparently, there were already commemoration days for the Hamadiyya massacres from 1894 to 1896. Many Armenians who settled in this area had fled the Hamadiyya massacres, so they were already having commemoration activities for that. They felt like it was necessary to have a national day of mourning for Armenians for the martyrs that were being created. And note the timeline, it's October 21st, 1915. So it's actually the same year as the outset of the Armenian Genocide. And some of the things that the editorial was calling for was for there to be mourning, but it had to be not just symbolic, but it had to serve a kind of purpose, a national purpose. So the tone of it is very kind of instrumental in a way that there shouldn't be too much emotion, but the emotion should actually be constrained and focused very much on the national cause. So when we come together, it's not only for sighing and crying for their death, but rather to honor and glorify their unforgettable memory. And then there's actually a quote that says, although they died, they are still speaking. And so it was a very haunting quotation, but the idea that the dead are still with us in some way, and we have to recognize them. And there is indeed a reference to these massacres in light of the previous massacres, noting that this one seems to be much larger. The path is bitter, the sorrow is deep, but now is not the time to weaken ourselves by mourning. So the tone of the editorial is that you're weakened by too much mourning, but it has to be done in the service of national duty and executed flawlessly. So some of the early commemoration activities that we have, and again, I don't have a great deal of information about this, but I'm reading some of these magazines that we have in our archives at Clark, and I'm finding that there are days of memorial or Sikahantes, mourning ceremonies for specific people. And in this case, one of the early events in Boston on January 1916 was to remember 4 Armenian professors who were murdered at Euphrates College. And this seems to be one of the earliest events. Again, not on the ceremonial timeline, and by that I mean ceremonial time like the calendar that will eventually be set. We have other events that took place in places like Providence, and that event in 1916 was actually on the April 24th day, and this was a requiem that was performed. Yeah, a requiem that was performed at Targmanchat's Apostolic Church, which I think doesn't exist anymore. If it does, please let me know, but I wasn't able to find that it existed any longer. From there on, after that date, we start to see April 24th cohering as a date in which these events take place. And a lot of times, these events would accompany fundraising. In fact, some of these magazines are actually talking about donations that are collected during these ceremonies and sent to aid starving Armenian survivors in the Near East. Another example of where we have some early commemoration events might surprise you. One of the first in the Near East, that is in Damascus, not Constantinople in 1919. Many of us think of 1919. In fact, I did as well. But Haratun Marutian's research has shown that actually it was at Surp Sarkis in Damascus, which is actually a vank or a monastery, and now serves as a church for the Damascus Armenian community. But they had their own event on October 28th, 1918. That's in Bab Sharki in Damascus, and there was participation actually from local officials because at that time King Faisal had set up his Arab government in Damascus, and they were very supportive of the Armenians. They actually assisted in the orphan rescue, and so at that time they attended, and so did British officials and French officials and the Catholicos of Sis. We also have another event that took place in Aleppo on January 20th, 1919. I just offer this image of the internal courtyard of 40 Martyrs Church in Aleppo, where there's actually today a 1915 monument. Again, this is the church has constructed this monument. It's still there. But this event on January 20th, 1919 was organized by the Armenian Legion, a unit of the French Army or French Foreign Legion that fought against the Ottoman Empire. And here you'd had 100,000 Armenians had settled in Aleppo, been deported to Aleppo, but many of them stayed on. And they came out to remember the fallen. And there were signs in both Arabic and Armenian at the event. And one of the main organizers of the event was Father Bartholomew, who had helped prepare the defenses of Zeytun in 1895. He was on the organizing committee for the commemoration. Probably the better known event is in Constantinople. If you can imagine, right after the armistice, right after the peace is signed after World War I, Armenians of Constantinople, of Istanbul, come together on April 24th to have a commemoration event here at the Holy Trinity Armenian Church. And if you know that place, it's right there in the Balak Pazara off of Istiklal. It's a great site because it connects to Istiklal Street, which eventually connects to Taksim Square. So it's a great processional space. It had been used for other kinds of processions in the past. And it's also a 19th century church by Garabat Balyan. But importantly, in this activity, we had a ceremony that included the opening with Chopin's funeral march and a closing with Beethoven's funeral march. And at the event, there were speakers like Yerevan Odian, spoke at the event to talk about his trials and his survival in Dayr. And they also read the poetry of Siamanto at the event. And so it combined kind of a civil and a religious ceremony. It had some elements that were so-called Western with the Beethoven and Chopin connected to Armenian literature and literary traditions. And here the event was really focused on remembering the intellectuals and who were rounded up, the 250 intellectuals. Eventually, you'll have Teotig, again with his Hushartsan volume that he will create to commemorate 1919. And I want to thank Lerna Ekmekcioglu for sharing her copy of this PDF with me. But in the volume, he actually remembers those intellectuals once again, like we have Daniel Varoujan. We also have, I found a woman, it's very rare to find, but here is a nun, Camila, who was martyred. And note here, 761, so it's beyond the 250, but we'll have Teotik remembering in a volume, in a book, 761 martyrs, including, next to Camelia are also some other nuns, and Siamanto. And the cover of Hushartsan is amazing because it contains the only photograph of the Armenian Genocide Memorial that was erected in 1919 for Armenian martyrs of the Armenian Genocide. It was inside Gezi Park in Taksim Square. And it lasted until 1921. It was dismantled during Ataturk's war of liberation, right? And like creating the modern state of Turkey, they will dismantle. So what happened to this monument, we don't know. The base of it allegedly ended up in the Ottoman barracks, but this is the only known photograph of it. And so there was, in fact, a monument to 1915 in the center of Constantinople, but it will be removed by nationalist forces. And I just wanted to plug this book by Teotig. It's actually for sale in NAASR's bookstore. It's a translation of it, and I only discovered a few days ago that it was translated. So, and here is a complete translation of all of the martyrs and the small biographies that he compiled, along with some of the texts that were created by the 1919 Commemoration Committee. And you might notice, too, that it's April 11th. And that's because there was not a complete conversion to the Gregorian calendar yet. So sometimes you'll see April 11th or April 21st or 24th. So eventually there will be a consolidation on the new calendar of April 24th. So I want to just show you a few images of Taksim Square, because many of you may know, but others may not know, that Taksim Square itself, and Gezi Park in particular, was an Armenian cemetery, and that it was Surpagop church, and you can see here the ancient Armenian, the old Armenian cemetery is listed on the map, and that these headstones, from the cemetery were removed, some of them repurposed, but that this was also going to be a site of protest in 2013. So during the protests, some of the activists made others aware of the true history of Gezi Park, that it was in fact an Armenian cemetery. And so Armenian activists with Nor Zartank actually created, cardboard headstones to point out that this was an Armenian cemetery, Surpagop Armenian cemetery, that was dismantled in 1939 in order to gentrify the city. And actually, it was a French architect who redesigned the square. And now, I haven't been back since some of the new designs, but I'm sure it's absolutely horrifying. But I'll take it in when I see it one day. But yet, this is also a processional space up until recent years. Again, 3 or 4 years ago, when the government halted not only Armenian Genocide Commemoration Day, but also Pride Day, Queer Pride Day, which was very popular, through the processional space of Istiklal up to Taksim Square. And so here you can see people would use, and to me this is very interesting, to use their body to kind of mark out space where there is no monument. And we'll find something very similar happens in al-Zur on April 24th. In spaces that aren't marked with monuments, people will mark them out with their own placards, with their own bodies. And this is Haydar Pasha train station, which was where many of those intellectuals on April 24th were deported out to the provinces and disappeared. I wanted to point out a couple of other places off the beaten path, so to speak. Many of us descended on Istanbul or Constantinople in 2015. I descended on Diyarbakir in order to commemorate the Armenian genocide with Turkish and Kurdish and Armenian activists. And one of the places we went is an unmarked place in Chungush that many of you who've been there would know, where a site of mass murder took place of the Chungush Armenians. Up above on the hill is actually a schoolhouse. And it was very disturbing because April 24th is Children's Day in Turkey. So the children were playing and celebrating above this place called Dudun, which is a site of mass killing, where Armenians were deported and murdered in this place that's a large crevasse and pushed down into this crevasse. But there were also processions such as this where we marched through Diyarbakir, and we went and had a rally at the end of that march. And at the time, Selahaddin Demirtas spoke at the rally. And we prayed and we chanted, and a lot of these activities also, they have not resurfaced, but I think were very important in kind of marking out space where there is no monument. Except in Diyarbakir, there's a little known monument. I don't know if I would call it a genocide monument. It's a shared pain. It's very destroyed. It's even in worse condition now. Ortak Veja. My Turkish sounds terrible, I'm sorry, but it's Shared Pain Monument, and it's in multiple languages, even including Hebrew, but it's in Kurdish, and it's sort of commemorating shared suffering. It's a little cryptic, and it's actually made out of some kind of plastic type material, so it's deteriorating, and again, in really poor condition, but it's probably the closest thing you would have to a monument in the region. The rest is completely unmarked terrain. But we do have, in fact, the Armenian official memorial established in 1967 in Yerevan. And again, thinking about there's a longer history of Soviet suppression of commemoration of the Armenian genocide that really complicates the matter. And you have it eventually April 24th instated on the church calendar in 1964. And then we start to see the push for a dedicated monument. And so this becomes the first state memorial for the Armenian genocide, especially if we think about after 1988 and after the breakaway from the Soviet Union. But set on a hill that dominates the landscape. It's in harmony with the surroundings. It's very austere. It outlines, again, it's very, to my eye, brutalist, but it was actually designed by a jury, actually selected from it by a jury. There was a competition, actually. It was headed by Armenian architect Gregorian. And they convened in 1964, and they had discussions, and then they selected a design. And the architects were Arthur Tarkhanyan and Sashur Kalashian. And they created these khachar-type stones. Again, it's very austere, not quite like khachar, but resemble in some way khachkars, and symbolize mourning and memory of the people. But of course, the fire symbolizes rebirth of the nation. And there are 12 slabs with original homeland and province names that you can see as you approach to sort of remember the homeland. Again, thinking about the design of it and what it's meant to invoke. And I think it's very important that people have to walk, and it's very arduous on the body to actually get there and back down. It's uphill. Much like a pilgrimage, it kind of takes a toll on the body. That's true about Dayr as well. So the museum will eventually be opened next to it in 1995 and commemorate the 80th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide. And so I think this is a well-known, what we call a site of memory. It's a well-known established state memorial that we can look to. That's, we don't have to worry, for example, about it being erased in the future. But I'm going to take you to a place where there's been a lot of erasure. And this is actually the core of what I work on in my book, which is Dayr. And many of you might be familiar with Dayr if you saw Peter Balakian leading 60 Minutes out there in 2010. And the voiceover for 60 Minutes special on Dayr, Battle Over History, is that Dayr to the Armenians is what Auschwitz is to the Jews. And yet it's not Auschwitz at all. I mean, because Auschwitz is a state memorial. It's managed, it's marked, it's preserved in a certain kind of way. Dayr doesn't have that level of preservation. So I was very interested in what people do in a circumstance where you don't have clearly marked spaces. So I look at them as non-sites of memory, really the opposite of what we have in Yerevan. Unmarked spaces that sometimes can produce hauntings or uncanny experiences among people who go there. And I also wanted to theorize the collection of bones that Armenians conducted in the desert while these practices were happening. These vernacular memory practices are largely outside of the state, this being the Syrian state's purview, but you would have local Arabs that would actually help with excavations, help Armenians navigate these places. And then Armenians would collect the bones as relics, actually calling them masunkner, calling them relics in their recollections. And so I was interested in how these recollections formed and to really try to make sense out of this practice, which has a very ancient heritage within the church. These are martyrs, and these are the bones of martyrs, and they are collected as proof of faith, proof of history, especially in light of state denial. So I wanted to look at Dayr to think about what kind of stories it could tell. I'll move here. So one of the stories I found that was early evidence of Armenians trying to create a monument in Dayr. There was no monument, of course, in 1915 or 1919, but here, Janik Yeranosian, he was one of the Armenians whose family had settled in Dayr after the Armenian Genocide. So he was a Dayri Armenian of Dayr. And around 1927-28, they discovered 10 kilometers outside of Dayr there was a mass grave of Armenians. So the local Armenian community went out to collect those remains to create a monument. He remembers being a small child, and this is archived at Shoah Foundation. You can watch it yourself. He remembers as a small child helping to dig and collect bones. The Armenians brought those bones back to Dayr and created a monument. But he recalls that some years later, an Arab farmer just plowed over top of them. So the monument was just gone. We have also a kind of contemporary, somewhat contemporary with that period, people going to Dayr to make pilgrimage or to witness. And I think this photograph really summarizes it like the best. It's iconic in the sense we have Gomes or Vahan Papazian going to Dayr. He went with a humanitarian, a well-known Norwegian humanitarian, Catherine Bjorn, who took this photograph, and he's sort of modeling for us how we witness at Dayr. This could be staged. I mean, there's like a femur sticking out of the ground in this photograph, but it's iconic in the sense that it's sort of framing for us how we witness. We look upon the bones and we reflect. And many others followed his footsteps. Hamas Dayr wrote With a Skull, Kangimahet, and his essay, he actually collected a skull, apparently, while he was in Dayr, and he used it as a muse while he was writing, and it's been beautifully translated by Tatul Sonnets, this essay. But he talked about the desire to bond with our people's grief, to make it part of my body and my consciousness. I wanted to go from Lebanon to Dayr, that immense graveyard of our martyrs. And so he describes actually removing a skull. I did go to a few archives to try to find the actual skull, but I did not find it. So I don't know where it went, but apparently he did have a skull. And he describes lifting it out. And then again, the skull becomes a chalice in the Eucharist. It's fascinating because it becomes all of a sudden sanctified. And he imagined actually the skull belonging to priests. He offers caricatures of priests to whom this skull might belong, because he refrains repeatedly through the essay, if only I knew the name of that skull, if only I knew the name of that skull. So that desire to name, that desire to create a gravestone or to place a name on the bones, it's a common drive among those who witness Dayr and write about Dayr. And then I have like a remarkable story. You will recognize the photograph when I show it to you, but it is about the excavation at Dayr by Haratun Hovakimian, who went there in 1938 at the behest of the Catholicosate of Sis. They sent Haratun Hovakimian, who was actually a member of the Vorpa Havak. He was a member of the orphan collection, like going out and rescuing orphans and widows after the Armenian Genocide. This time, he's going there for a different purpose, to rescue bones. So he actually has an unpublished memoir in Yerevan, and he describes how he was on a mission to find the bones of Krikor Zohrab and Vartkes Serengulyan, 2 martyrs from April 24th. And the idea was to find known martyrs, with bones with names, right, to name those bones. And it's known from different accounts, including the work of Raymond Kevorkian, that Krikor Zohrab and Vartkes were murdered in Urfa. So he was trying to get inside Urfa, and with the help of Kurds, he was dressed here. As he says, he's dressed like a Kurd with a French rifle on a mule. The Kurds of the Bedr Khan tribe snuck him inside to go up to Urfa to try to retrieve these bones. But when he went to the exact place, the Karakopru, where they were murdered, it was heavily guarded by Turkish gendarmes, so he couldn't make his way in. So he comes back to Dayr and he starts trying to find known bones of martyrs in Dayr. And so that's what brings us to the next story here. I had to say, because I work on gender too, and women don't get mentioned very often. So here is Degin Satanik. You need to know who she is. She's also has her photograph pasted in his memoir, and her husband were really well known rescuers of Armenians. So in Karen Yappe's files, if you know Karen Yappe, the famous Danish rescuer, she often refers to the tailor in Dayr, and you know who he is. It's Satanik's husband. Satanik and Krikor were part of, like, I would call them the Armenian Underground Railroad. They were rescuing Armenians and getting them out of Dayr during and after the war. And so Satanik knew where there were some bones, and eventually they find the bones of a martyr named Karanfalian. And so he digs up those bones with her assistance. But then he decides to go and dig up some more bones that he finds. And this iconic photograph, which I know you've seen, many have seen it, this iconic photograph, and there were many photographs snapped that day, but this one is probably the most well-known, was taken near the Dayr Bridge, according to the AGMI, or the Armenian Genocide Museum Institute in Yerevan. And it was here that a number of orphans from Dayr were marched out and murdered at the Dayr Bridge. At the site, this is a quote from him, "At the site, there were both natural and man-made holes in the earth." He said they wasted no time and began digging. With the bell ringer of the Harepsime Church, now Harepsime Church was the Armenian church in Dayr, we started to work on the hole at the right side of the path. The bell ringer dug the hole in the sand, and I shoveled it. After a while, we found ourselves in a frightening scene. While digging, we found skulls without eyes, arm bones, and other things. And this is when Satanik had to leave. She couldn't bear it anymore. So these bones, actually, 4 boxes of these bones will eventually find their way to Antelias in Lebanon and become part of this memorial at the Catholicosate of Sis. So if you've been there, you've seen it. You may not know the full origins of those bones, but that's where they ended up. Some of the bones may have stayed behind at Dayr, but they were supposed to be part of this 4 boxes that were boxed up and sent in order to create a proper monument for them in one of the most holy places for Armenians in the region. So the thing about this ossuary here is that it's very reflective. And so I noticed when I went and visited it myself, like, you can see a reflection of yourself upon the bones. And I felt like that was artistically really significant, that somehow through the reflective gaze, you are joined together with the bones of martyrs. And building ossuaries has a very long tradition in Christianity. I make some gestures to, for example, the arm of Krikor Lusavoric, which is a very sacred relic to the Armenian tradition. But ossuaries also are I'd say a very universal practice among Christians. So what I wanted to do with my remaining time was take you on some of these journeys to places like Dayr, the Armenian Martyrs Church, which was a central site where Armenians would go when they would make pilgrimage to Dayr. And I don't know if you know about this history, but it was actually at the behest of Archbishop Suren Kataroyan of Aleppo that this was built. And similarly to Tsitsernakaberd, it was through competition that there was a competition for best design, and Sarkis Belmanoukian won best competition design. He is still living in Los Angeles, I believe. I really wanted to interview him for my book, but I had trouble reaching him. I just couldn't get contact with him. But the design was quite amazing, and it was because Archbishop Suren was very embarrassed at the state of the St. Harepsime Church. So there was a church called St. Harepsime, and it was a disarray. And when he would take Armenian dignitaries there, he was embarrassed. He wanted to build something that really did justice to the martyrs. And so it's quite an amazing story. But he said that an Armenian from Syria presented him with a giant kilo bag full of gold and handed it to him to build his church. And the gold at that time was worth 30,000 Syrian lira, which apparently at that time was a lot. It's not a lot today. But he said he would offer more once the building was underway, in which he did. He offered 800,000 more Syrian lira to complete the building once they broke ground. And in his testimony, Kataroyan, who unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago, talks about the opening day and how Catholicos Karakin came and actually fell to his knees and supplicated himself, 25 meters, for 25 meters leading up to the church, that it was really amazing for people to have such a structure. And that many Dayri Muslims of Dayr-Zur, or Dayri Muslims, came to the event, and some of them disclosed that they were actually crypto-Armenians. One of my favorite stories he shares is that there was a woman who came to the event, and that she pulled up her sleeve, and she had a tattoo in Armenian on her arm that read Takuhi in Armenian. And she said, this is my true name. I'm here today. My mother put this tattoo on my arm so I would never forget my Armenian name. And she said, let this be a penance for my sin, that I took a foreign man for my husband. Despite this, I'm still visiting the Armenian martyrs. This was according to an interview that Katroyan did before he passed away. This is what the interior of the church looked like. There was a museum in the basement. It included an ossuary, and here we have all of the funerary elements. This is beautifully described by Peter Balakian in a way I'll never be able to convey today. But you've got the bones, and these bones, from what I know, are transferred from St. Haripsame, where some bones had been kept before. You have khachkars, and then you also have vials of soil, akhtamar, van, and ani. And so soil from the homeland to properly inter or symbolically inter the martyrs, to give them the burial they deserve. Noritsa Matosian had this beautiful image of this box. She used the material, so she no longer has the box. But the museum used to sell these boxes so you could hold your own ceremony if you found bones during your journey, to implant a khachkar in the ground, to light some incense, light a candle. There are 2 candles as well. And then pilgrims who didn't go home immediately after that might go to Mergeda. And Mergeda is about 70 kilometers north along the road to Hasake. And this is what it would look like: buses and buses and buses of Armenians from Aleppo to Damascus, sometimes from Beirut. Sometimes people would be on the road for, 15 hours just the driving in one single day. Very few people would want to stay overnight. Almost no one stays overnight. You just go and you leave because it's a haunted place. But behind Mergeda are many, many bones. And you may have seen these images before. I'm borrowing some from Alexandra Avakian, who did a story about this, of people digging and collecting. But among them, you can also see Arabs who are helping. Very common. Many people described in their oral testimonies that local Dayri or local Arabs would help them. And then inside there was a chapel, another chapel that was also built by Suren, Archbishop Suren at Mergeda. It also, as you'll know, neither of these places exist anymore. They were destroyed in the war, but it also had an ossuary. It was a very simple chapel, and I interviewed Suzanne Khardalian about her experience at Mergeda, because in her film, her documentary Grandma's Tattoos also features scenes from Dayr-Zur, and she talked about feeling just completely unsettled being in Mergeda. She described not knowing where to step because it's that overwhelmingly a cemetery. She described, what are you doing? This little boy is digging and he finds a tooth and he puts it in my hand and I didn't know what to do. I remember the moment so clearly. So I closed my hand first and I said, God, I have this relative's tooth in my hand somehow. What do I do with it? It was a very strange reaction I had. I dropped it back where it was. I know some people take things with them, but I couldn't do it. It was scary somehow to confront the remains of a person like that. She offered some amazing testimony. She's got this amazing way of seeing the world. I found the interviews with her really illuminating, but quite literally not knowing where to step, where to put your foot, where to sit, because of how saturated that place is. So Mergeda, people would go to that place because it had the chapel. And again, that chapel was built in 1990 as well as the Dayr-Zur church. But the last station on this journey would be Shaddade. And Shaddade is where the caves are. These caves which you may have read about or heard about, where Armenians were thrown in and murdered horrifically. But they're not easy to get to, which is why I made this map. I thought I would never find it again. So I drew a map on my lap while going out there. But my contact and friend, Saad Assad, was from Shaddadi, from the city of Shaddadi, and knew where the caves were because his father had taught him, and his grandmother actually had taught him where they were. So if you want to go to this place, it's completely unmarked, and there's actually not even a stair to get down into that space. You have to go down a kind of pole and slide down the pole to get into these caves. And the last time that I went there with him, we went again in 2008, but I was with a photojournalist in 2007, and we took some photographs of him because he was having trouble finding his way back to the cave. Saad was actually, his grandmother was an Armenian who was rescued before the group she was with went to those caves. So remembering the caves was really important to him, but he was losing his vision because he had diabetes. So we were with him when my friend, a photojournalist, Catherine Cook, snapped this photo of him being lost in the desert. But soon afterward, we found a Syrian soldier who said, oh, the caves, they're right over there. So apparently the locals actually know where they were. It wasn't, not all was lost. But these are my final two slides, and it's really about the Dayr Church, which if you've tracked events, you'll know that it was destroyed in 2014, and it was when Islamic State had assumed control of Dayr. Dayr has been split between Kurds and the regime forces off and on over the last decade, but there was a period when Islamic State controlled it, and that's when the destruction of the church and museum, which was the central shrine for regional Syrian Armenians and Lebanese Armenians to go and pay pilgrimage on April 24th. So there are attempts to rebuild it. There are discussions about rebuilding it. There was a group from Kamishli, a priest from Archbishop from Kamishli, who actually took a delegation to Dayr, and he was gunned down while trying to begin planning the rebuilding. Yeah, there are Islamic State sleeper cells everywhere out there. So this delegation from Kamishli 3 years ago went out to begin planning to rebuild the Dayr church, and they were gunned down in Dayr. And their car was clearly marked, actually. So the question is, what happens next? And there are discussions about rebuilding. Know that the Armenian church in Aleppo was also bombed twice during the Syrian war. So, and it's rebuilt now. They repaired it. But I asked Peter Balakian very early on. This was actually in 2017. I interviewed him for the book, and it was very early on in the process. But I asked him what should happen at war's end, because so much has happened in Dayr since the Armenian Genocide. There are mass graves of Yazidis, and there are mass graves of Sunni tribesmen of the Shaitat tribe that resisted Islamic State. They were killed in mass out there as well. So now there's a lot of layered history. So I was asking what should happen at war's end, especially now that the church is gone. And this is his reply, and this is also my conclusion. He said, it would be important for the Armenian monuments to be remade. This is an historical ground with large ethical significance for the world, not just for Armenians. A small part of Dayr could become a kind of peace park if there were the right kind of leadership involved, and a place where human rights atrocities are reckoned with. Historical memory in public spheres matters to all nations, and as the largest graveyard of the Armenian genocide, Dayr is a tragic and morally important place and space. So I leave you with his words. I mean, I personally hope that I can be involved in whatever is built in Dayr in the future, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you for coming. And we are to use the microphone up here, I think, right? Correct?
We are all to use microphones whenever possible. Thank you so much, Elyse. And I'm actually going to start, if I could, with a question from online, because I'm afraid my phone may die before too many more. And it was actually a question I was going to ask as well. The question is, do we know for certain that the Constantinople monument that's shown on the cover of Husharzan Teotig's book was ever actually put in place. I have read, I thought, somewhere, that it was conceptualized but never actually put into place. Unfortunately, I can't remember where I read that, but it seems to be indicated also by the question from online. Do
Well,
we know for sure?
I mean, I don't think we know for sure, but I believe, I'm trying to remember if it was Marutian's essay or another that I read that it was, but again, there's always room for, maybe this person who has this question has some knowledge that I don't have, like maybe they have some inkling. Have you?
We'll find out, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I would be interested in knowing where the skepticism over that comes from. Yeah.
And in the room, please, if you have questions.
And I would just say one thing is I don't write about the Boston. I mean, my book, I don't cover the Boston or Rhode Island or much about Istanbul or Constantinople ceremonies because I'm largely centered on Syria. That means that there's so much room for someone else to actually write that book and do that research.
For sure.
I actually was just trying to broaden it for this particular talk.
Do you know at all what shape, what form those commemorations took, the very early commemorations here in Boston and in Providence?
I got all my information from Marutian's excellent article, which only came out 2 years ago, so it's very fresh. I highly recommend it. But yeah, he's the one who documented them. And it's very brief. It's not the focus of his article because he's actually doing a very comprehensive view of commemoration activities as well. I was looking for photos, but I did not find any on Project Save, but that doesn't mean there aren't some maybe in private collections somewhere or somewhere else.
If you have any in your collections, please let us know.
Yeah.
There's a cliche, as I'm sure you know, because it's a cliche, that before 1965, there was this total silence, which of course we know really wasn't the case. Things certainly changed in 1965, but yeah, it seems to be a lot of ground for doing research on what was going on in the decades between 1915 and 1965, for sure.
Yeah, it's in. So we were gifted Gochnag at Clark, and it's right next to my office. So I just started looking, and Armenians are writing about this a lot in 1915 and 1916. And I'm not an Americanist. Like my research is very much centered on Syria, and I'm an Ottomanist by training. So, but I just think it's basically uncharted territory, and there's a lot of material. I didn't see photographs, actually. I wish there had been photographs in the magazines, but there's a lot of writing about commemoration. And it seems as though, at least in that magazine, and I just looked at some issues, it's the women who are actually agitating for it. So I think there's some really great history that could be written from those documents.
Yes, Tanya. If I may impose, thank you.
Hi, thank you, Elyse. Great talk, thank you, very moving. I'm just curious how they actually identify bones as, whose bone is, which bone belongs to whom? How do they do that?
Well, first of all, you would need a proper excavation, and I think a lot of us, including Raymond Kevorkian, had laid plans. Oh, I had wanted a proper excavation. Raymond Kevorkian began the process, and it was halted. So you need scientists to do that, and there's nothing about this that's scientific at all. It's just people are purely motivated by mourning rituals, the collecting of bones. And because it's not even a centered ritual, people are doing different things with the bones as well. So the question of identity, maybe implied in your question, is also about DNA testing, maybe, or?
Maybe. I'm just saying they were going to look for specific bones of specific people.
Yeah, which is amazing to
you
think
mean
about
Haratun Hovakimian? He wanted witnesses to guide him to individuals. So Satanik, she knew this priest this Vardabek, excuse me, who was murdered by the state, so she knew where he was interred. So that's how he was able to find specific identities, but the rest, there's no identity. He needed someone's testimony to identify at that period of time. And, you know, he's not a scientist either.
Right.
He's just a person who knows the region well, because he had treaded a lot through that terrain while he was rescuing Armenian widows and children.
And the second question, I know other people have brought this up other times, is whether taking the bones away is actually also destroying evidence or historical sort of witnessing. On the other hand, if no one is taking care of the place, yeah.
I don't have any hope that there would ever be any proper excavation of Dayr ever. Certainly not with the new government also in Syria. We know what some of the preconditions are for Turkey's foreign policy, and it's genocide denial, and it's silencing. So I just don't think, I gave up on that only because even under better conditions, it never happened. And so Kevorkian's mission, it was closed down after 4 days, I believe. He had permission from the Syrian government, and then the excavation was closed. He was excavating Ras Al Ain, Ras Al Ain has its own memory, right? And I mean, you could do a whole book about Ras Al Ain as well, but there were never those kinds of practices there. So I think it would have been amazing to see what his results were, and it was a scientific mission. But I personally gave up on hope for that. And that's why I was interested in that kind of more non-scientific approach to the bones, how people are making sense out of it in their own way with the absence of science and the absence of state care.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Tanya.
Nanor?
Hi, Elyse. Hi. I know you were pretty impressed with the Diyarbakir commemorations when you were there, especially when you juxtapose it with the Istanbul commemorations. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that, about your experience there. And also, I know that commemorations in Turkey in recent years have started in 2010, but do you know of anything prior to that in Diyarbakir, even like smaller or more private things or anything like that?
That's a good question. So I would say, actually, in my haste, I forgot to mention Ara Sarafian actually organized the Diyarbakir commemorations in 2015, and it was, I mean, I knew Ara from graduate school, so I was so happy that I found out about it and that I went, because the whole time leading up to April 24th, we were meeting with Kurds. We met with Kurds from families that had rescued Armenians. And so there were Kurdish chiefs who refused to hand over their Armenians and were punished for it by the state. We met also activists who were actively working on civil society issues. And when we went through towns like Bitlis, for me what was really moving was when we're a group of mostly Armenians walking through Bitlis, all these people from Bitlis came up to us and started saying, "I'm Armenian too." And then they were also saying, you know, we may not be here in big numbers anymore, but look, this land is still called Hagop's land. The locals are still referring to it, and it was very touching. A local Kurd actually had an exhibition in Bitlis to remember the Armenians on Armenian Genocide Commemoration Day in 2015. And a man came up to me and was asking, "Can you help me find the owner of this ring? I think it might belong to an Armenian, and I found it on my land. I want to give it back to the true owner." And so it was like this, you know, for a lot of us have been raised, I think, with stories. You know, of course, Kurds were major perpetrators, but you could see firsthand that many people had done the work of really thinking through history. And so I think a lot of the civil society movement in Eastern Turkey actually helped people get there. But and I was very honored to be in Diyarbakir on that day. I built some relationships with people. I think some of us have over the years. Islamized Armenians who lived there. And so when we're there, it makes them feel so empowered. And I also felt very empowered to be with them and to be, again, just, to be in the restored church, but a lot also has changed since 2015 because that's also a threshold year for Turkish politics where we had an attack on those very same areas. And, 2015 and 2016, parts of Diyarbakir were destroyed by the state after those events. So it was really kind of a calm before a larger storm. But I do think generally when we can be there, it's important because we do have people there. They need to see us. That's why it's important, like Hosenk Buradayez, being there is important if you can go and if you can be involved.
Elyse, this is a slight change of topic, but maybe it will be also uplifting in some way. Could you tell us a little bit about what's happening at Clark with the Holocaust Center and your department, the Genocide Studies, and what the vision is, and how this work is integrated, what's coming out from Clark?
Wow, okay. It's from a Clarkie.
Yeah.
No, well, Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, I am the only person doing the Armenian history, but, I'm offering new classes and, a course on the Armenian genocide, of course, but also developing a course that looks at Armenia, nation and diaspora. It's like imagining Armenia as nation and also in the diaspora. And I do, in fact, hope to bring some of my students to the museum and to, Belmont and Watertown in the fall. Generally, we have a lot going on where, we have people who are also working on African genocides. We have a current faculty member who works on that, another who's working on Ukraine and looks at, actually, her work is largely centered on the question of gender and genocide, so it really does overlap in really nice ways with my own work. So we're trying to offer, I think, as much breadth as we can, but it is, of course, a Holocaust and Genocide Center. So we do, have a Holocaust conference next week on, the elderly Jews in the Holocaust. But we are bringing speakers. I'm also bringing Hori and Talin, who are going to talk about Armenian women and feminism in pre-revolutionary Iran on May 2nd. So we're trying to offer, I think, some breadth. And I wish you'd ask this question of Thomas, because I know he would give a much better answer than I just have. But I'm getting involved in the community, and I want to be involved in the community. That includes, getting involved with, and I'm happy to collaborate, bringing musicians, art, curation, like you do at the museum. I think these are great ways to reach the public with history, public history. I'm very interested in that, so I look forward to joining you all, and if you have projects, please share them with me.
Yes, Roger.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We commemorate April 24th. Is it, do Armenians and people in general, when they learn about this, do they look at this as the first event, the actual beginning of the genocide? Because, I know it's a major event, and it's symbolic because of, the intellectuals, the religious leaders, community leaders that were deported and killed. But, it's really happened so much before that. April 10th, my birthday, believe it or not, like they say, my readings from, I think it was Christopher Walker, Armenia, is it Survival of a Nation, the name, the title? And also Stanley Kerr's Lions of Marsh. I believe I read about April 10th being the Zeytin, where the Turkish army, they went all the way into Zeytin, then they worked their way backwards, so they could flush the Armenians out that way. And also I have an uncle, a great uncle, and he had to leave Van because all the males in the family were killed and piled in the town square, or the city square, and they were identified by the shoes they wore because they were shoemakers. But this is 2 years before 1915. So much happened to build up to it, but there's a reason I mean, obvious reason, I guess, right, April 24th, because of the enormity of the loss and what was done. So I don't know what my point is except saying that, you know, and what your thoughts are about that.
Well,
Thank
I'm
you.
going to take your question/comment as kind of also a critique of April 24th. I think it's justified. Like I said, the commemoration in Istanbul, at Constantinople, was very centered on the intellectuals, but as your own examples are showing, I mean, there's a different timeline, there are different dates when events happened, and there's also like everyday people's experiences that are not reflected in April 24th. It's really about the intellectuals, and it's Ronald Sunni called April 24th was the decapitation of the Armenians, and you can critique that because when you look at on the ground, well, Armenians were completely mobilized. Like our organizations were mobilized. They were rescuing themselves. That's, Khachik Muradian's really excellent book on that. It's talking about Armenian Resistance Network, like how Armenians mobilized to rescue their own, to supply food to Armenians inside the deportation lines. So April 24th doesn't reflect that on the ground experience in the sense that, April 24th influenced the intellectuals in Istanbul, but might not reflect the experience of Van or another place. As historians, we talk about the invention of tradition. So states create holidays, and there are like leaps, imaginative leaps that happen when you create any holiday. And so that's, I think, April 24th, it's standing in for everyone, but if you look at the actual history, it's about a particular moment. Mm-hmm.
Hi, this was fascinating. I really learned a lot today. But I had a question about, do you have relationships or connections with Turkish colleagues, and do you have Turkish students in any of your years of teaching?
That's a good question. Our field has become, like the field of Armenian genocide studies and the field of Ottoman studies has taken some very different turns. It is not what it was 30 years ago. And I mean that in a very good way. Like we have scholars who are trying to learn Armenian so that they can write Ottoman history that includes Armenian perspectives. I could have never imagined that. I think that's great. We have Turkish scholars who are writing about the Armenian genocide. A lot of them. I was at a conference at University of Michigan a couple weeks ago, and the panel was all Turkish scholars working on the Armenian genocide, one working on prisons and wants to tie together Armenian experiences in prison during the Armenian genocide with also experiences after the Armenian genocide. Some of them are working on, various issues related to the Armenian genocide. So I think that's a really positive thing. Of course, my predecessor, Taner Akçam, is a Turkish historian of the Armenian genocide. But we also know not everybody, that doesn't reflect everyone's view. Like the intellectual circles tend to be sometimes, not always, a little more open and acknowledging. I mean, one of the students I met recently, he served time in Turkish prison for his political views, and I was, really moved by that when I found out about his experience. Like, some of the people who are doing this kind of work are actually endangered in Turkey, so that's why I would say we have to, be open to them and bring them in because they're not welcome in their own country because of the work they're doing and their political views. But that's not true for everyone, because I'm certainly someone who's angered other people in Ottoman history who, are still taking on a very nationalist point of view and believe that it's an affront to their identity, talking about the Armenian genocide. So that doesn't reflect everyone, of course.
Elyse, thank you so much for sharing this presentation with us. Really appreciate it, and we invite you all who are here, stick around, visit, and join with us, and thank you for being here.